This project is looking at commercial fisheries, which of course are hugely important in New Zealand, culturally, socially, economically, and in terms of their impact on the environment. Unlike some of the other projects that we've done, there's a lot of parallel pieces of work going on in this space, but our focus is very much on the future, imagining a new future for fisheries in which all the new science and data management techniques play a major role. There's lots of really exciting science and technology that can be applied to fish and is starting to be applied to fish, but it tends to be in a very piecemeal way. So I'm thinking of things like precision seafood harvesting and the Tiaki group, who are finding incredibly clever ways to just take the fish that are allowed and let the other ones go. I'm thinking of new genetic technologies that have been widely applied on land that can now be applied to fish breeding, of clever aquaculture techniques, of environmental DNA monitoring. So there's lots of state-of-the-art technologies that could make a huge difference that aren't yet being applied.
The size of the sector, it's important for New Zealand. We export in the order of $2 billion per annum. We probably have revenues of $4 billion. Estimates of people involved in the sector vary from probably 20 to 30,000 Kiwis. And it's got a significant capital investment. Importantly, it also represents the first pan-iwi settlement of settlement rights in terms of the Maori Fisheries Settlement Act. So you've got a fairly broad church of interests, from aquaculture, shellfish to wild harvest, a range of different methods of harvesting, a huge range of different products sold.
Regulation of commercial fisheries is really fraught and really complicated. And the good thing is there's some really great models that are being put together to enable us to manage the stocks. And in an ideal world, the models would spit out the perfect answer every time, and they'd be able to predict how new technology might change stocks over time. But in the real world, it's quite dark in the ocean, and the actual data that we've got is really limited and hard to capture. So I think one of our panel guests described it as driving by only looking in the rearview mirror. It's really not a data-rich environment at all. So the models are really crucial, but they don't tell us everything.
The quota management system came in the mid-1980s when it was quite clear that we were having a few problems in quite a few of the inshore fisheries. They also wanted a mechanism to be able to manage the deep water fisheries, which were just starting to develop after we declared our zone in 1978. So the idea behind the quota management system was to introduce output controls, unlike many of the management systems at the time that focused on input controls, where they might have closed areas or closed seasons, or they might dictate how the fishing gear should be altered. And often fishermen managed to get around those input controls by changing their gear designs or discovering new areas or so on. So the idea behind output controls is that you manage the fisheries by quotas.
We've got 642 stocks in the quota management system. A stock means a combination of a fish species in a geographical area. So 642, they're not all actually meaningful combinations because not all fish species occur in all areas. But it's something like 350 stocks that we monitor quite closely.
As you're probably aware, the quota management system was required to be brought in to halt the decline of stocks. It was brought in effectively as a sustainability measure. And in doing that, in doing so, the government of the day effectively neglected, completely forgot about its obligations to Māori under the Treaty of Waitangi, which guaranteed to Māori their fisheries, all of their taonga, including their fisheries. And so as a result of that, when the quota management was first brought in, a number of tribes, so mainly Ngaitahu, the Muri Whenua groups, the New Zealand Māori Council, and I think Waikato Tainui, they injuncted the introduction of any further species being introduced into the quota management system, and took legal action against the Crown until the Crown actually settled the issue of how would it make provision for Māori, given that their interests in fisheries had never been extinguished. In 1992, when the settlement was finalised, iwi would receive 20% of all new quota that was brought into the quota management system, plus $150 million to acquire a 50% share of Sealord to get Māori into the business and activity of fishing. And at the same time, the settlement also agreed to the codification of rules around how customary fishing would be undertaken moving forward.
The other area that I guess we really need to address in terms of Māori and fishing is the tension that arose when the QMS was introduced. So this isn't particularly in scope for what we're trying to do, but it's really important context in that the QMS was seen by Māori as at odds with the treaty and at odds with their fishing rights. And history is recent enough that that journey is still quite raw. And so if you suggest changing the way that we regulate or changing the way that we fish, we've learned that it's incredibly important to make sure that's done in partnership with Māori.
One of the exciting things about the introduction of the quota management system, because I was around when it was introduced, is just seeing how over the last 30 years some of the fisheries have recovered, particularly in the inshore space. So there are some species that are doing very well that were struggling when the system was introduced, and the catches were actually cut back to try and enable those fisheries to recover. So species like elephant fish around the South Island, they've significantly improved. So species like red gurnard, and we're also seeing with some of the snapper stocks that they're starting to improve as well. So that's exciting to see that happen.
The quota management system has one big disadvantage, and that is that we utilize models over a very long time, and I think they become insensitive over time to the changes that we are seeing out there. The other disadvantage is that the stakeholders that are all involved in utilizing our resources out there are not necessarily sitting around the same table and discussing the future of safeguarding our resources. So those would be great advances in what we do. But the basics of the quota management system I would leave as they are, because they do provide value.
The QMS, when it was brought in over 30 years ago, was quite revolutionary to actually start setting quotas and basically telling people how much they're able to take. It was a huge improvement on what had been happening previously. But what that meant is then people took ownership of the resource, and so 30 plus years later we need to be looking at better ways of managing our oceans and thinking about, does that model still work in the current society with different interests? How do we ultimately share that natural, native, living resource? I mean, it's the fish and taking things out of the ocean, really it's the last living resource that we're harvesting from the planet. We've stopped chopping down native trees, and that's something we as a society need to think about, how much we do that, and shifting the focus away more from just a pure sort of economic interest to thinking more about, well, what is the impact of our activities? How do we look more towards the future, particularly with the uncertainty around climate change? We need to scale back on how much we're taking. And if you look at the QMS, it doesn't have a great track record. If you look at the local fisheries here in the Hauraki Gulf, snapper, the estimate is they're at 20% of their historic levels. Crayfish, it's about 20%, but that, in our view, from research in and around marine reserves, is an overestimate. Crayfish are well below 10% of their historic levels.
In New Zealand, we manage our fisheries by single species. So we look at a population in isolation, a population of fish in isolation, and we look to see whether we're harvesting them too much or too little, and adjust the amount of fishing activity. And the way the system is designed, it's designed to maximise the amount of take from that population. it doesn't allow a big margin for error. So if we get it wrong, things collapse. And we've seen that happen, for example, in the Hauraki Gulf, where a recent report's described the crayfish population as functionally extinct.
In a number of fisheries, the recreational take is equal to, if not greater than, the commercial take, such as for snapper in the Hauraki Gulf. So it's really looking at the big picture, having a more holistic approach rather than singling out commercial fisheries or recreational fisheries. We do need to be working in a more integrated approach, and I think then we will get better buy-in from the different stakeholders, because at the moment it's much more of a us versus them, the recreational, the commercial, I guess environmental, and without an overarching sort of framework to better manage our oceans, we're going nowhere. So things need to change.
It is really interesting how difficult it is to figure out how many fish there are in the sea of each species in each area, and how much the methodology's developed over the years. We've got data from our commercial fishers, for starters. They keep logbooks and they have mandatory reporting. We use that to an extent. We also have a scientific observer program that collects information on the commercial catch, but also biological information on the various fish stocks that can enable us to determine how many fish are mature, you know, egg-laying fish, for example, what ages they are and what lengths they are and that kind of thing. We also get information from recreational surveys. Where we can, we try and get what we call fisheries independent information, which means we do statistically designed surveys using, for example, NIWA's vessels, the Tongaroa and the Kaharoa, and a couple of smaller vessels as well.
NIWA undertakes on contract around about 90% of all of the fisheries research that Fisheries New Zealand commissions each year to feed into their stock assessment and fisheries management processes. We undertake vessel-based surveys to assess stocks. We also analyse a lot of industry catch data as well, and we produce a lot of models that help us try to better understand what might be happening to particular fish stocks.
Some of the research techniques we use are bottom trawl surveys and acoustic surveys, particularly for fish that form quite dense spawning schools. Acoustics is a good method to use. The fishing industry also collects information on fish abundance from the catch rates that are achieved in the fisheries each year and look at how they change over time. And we also collect information on fish age, so we can age fish because they have these air bones that lay down rings each year like tree rings. And so we can collect information on fish size and age and see how they change over time. All that information is put into stock assessment models.
New Zealand fisheries scientists are very well connected to our international colleagues. Our models are as sophisticated as they get, as sophisticated as computing power allows them to be nowadays. But what really matters, what really does limit them, is having the right data.
One of the huge challenges is data management. And there's lots of technologies out there like machine learning, artificial intelligence, blockchain, that we can start to think about using to integrate all the data that we do have and see if we can work out better ways to monitor the environment in future with fewer parameters.
We spend about $20 million a year on research in fisheries. A lot of that is cost recovered from the fishing industry. The Crown pays a share, but it's something like 350 stocks that we monitor quite closely. Plus, we need to look at environmental effects of fishing. We need to investigate biodiversity and how that's trending. Make sure it's not trending down substantially. We also have international fisheries obligations because we do fish some highly migratory species. It also has to stretch to cover recreational fisheries research as well.
Quota owners are charged directly for the cost of doing the science to manage the stock that they have a quota ownership in. And of course, if you're running a business, you have there's quite a lot of incentive to reduce costs, to reduce outgoings, because that goes directly into your profit. So there's been a big incentive for the quota owners to not fund the science, on the basis that they think things are okay, and so that you know, that funding's gone down. But the difficulty with that is when you run into a problem, and we're now doing that with various stocks like crayfish off the northeast coast here. I mean, that stock has almost collapsed, and because there'd been very little investment in the science, no one knew what had happened, you know. So in order to manage well, you need to have that baseline science, so when something does when you start to get into trouble, you actually have some idea of what's happening and how you can adjust.
I'd be a fan of the Crown or the government putting in more money towards science to assist us with our fisheries management. The industry pays a significant amount in levies and stuff towards science every year, but of course it sort of gets devoted on key stocks that the industry is focused on. We have one of the, I think it's the 4th largest exclusive economic zone in the world. You know, the vast majority of our marine environment has not actually been tapped yet for its potential sustainable use, not just exploitation, but sustainable use.
As a country, we've tried to run a fisheries management system, you know, without funding it. It's sort of a cheap version, and you just can't do that for 30 years. That's what we've done. I think, you know, as the public, we need to invest in this, and we need to invest in good science and understanding of the ecosystems and what's happening, because we all have a stake in this.
In 2020, we can't really be talking about fisheries management on its own or conservation on its own. We need to be talking about ocean management and planning. And so fisheries can't be managed in isolation from marine protected areas. And that's the problem we have with the way we view our oceans. Is a lot of us like to go fishing. We like to be able to take a feed from the ocean, and that's what we've always done. And there's always been commercial fishing. But we need to be looking towards incorporating protection into our fisheries management, our ocean management, to provide sort of longer term sustainability.
We've seen develop over the last couple of decades more of an ecosystem approach to the science that we're doing. So the effects of fishing research, as well as trying to develop ecosystem approaches to manage marine systems. And I think in the future that's what we need to be able to develop more understanding about how fish interact with their environment and the effect that fishing has on the environment, especially with challenges like climate change.
The harder we fish populations, the lower we fish them down, the more vulnerable they are to those other impacts like climate change or sedimentation. Those impacts often get used as reasons why we shouldn't manage things better, because they're portrayed as being the impact that's causing a problem. But we know from marine protected areas that the populations, when you remove fishing, are actually fine. So examples again, crayfish, snapper, and as well as protecting a population, you're protecting the large individuals, and you restore a more natural sort of size distribution, and it's protection of those large individuals. So the big snapper or the big crayfish that are the important breeders, they produce a large amount of larvae relative to small snapper and crayfish, and they're also the important component of the ecosystem. Just as an example, a 60 centimetre snapper produces roughly the same number of eggs as 40 legal size snapper, 30 centimetre snapper. So we estimate that the egg production from the marine reserve here at Lee is about 20 times the egg production of the surrounding coast. So even protecting a small reserve, though this one's about 5 kilometres long, that's ultimately producing the same number of eggs and larvae as 100 kilometres of fished coast. And so we've done there's been genetic work done here that demonstrates that even protecting a population like we have here contributes larvae to the surrounding fisheries.
When we manage a species just on its own, we don't take account of the environmental consequences of doing that. And so, for example, in the case of the crayfish population in the Hauraki Gulf, removing the crayfish out of that population has allowed the kinna or the sea urchins to explode their population numbers, because the crayfish are natural predators of that species. And as a consequence, Those creatures are herbivorous, which means they eat plants, and so they've mowed down large areas of kelp forest or seaweed forest. And seaweed forest is really, really important in terms of a nursery habitat for lots of other fish species. It's also incredibly productive. It's one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. And so we've knocked that productivity out of our coastal ecosystems. So by mismanaging our fish stock, we've had these knock-on effects into the wider environment and to the whole way that ecosystem is performing.
We know that the oceans are already undergoing change. They're warming and some of the circulation patterns are changing due to wind shifts. And we also know that the oceans are acidifying. So as the carbon dioxide levels go up in the atmosphere, more of that carbon dioxide is entering the ocean. So the oceans are already, we think, around 30% more acidic than they were at the start of the Industrial Revolution, purely because of the increases in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. We don't have a good idea about what that will do to things like fish stocks, but it'll certainly have an impact on organisms that have a calcium-based shell, and that includes everything from plankton to shellfish and corals. But fish, of course, have calcium carbonate skeletons, so they could, and certainly some of the early life history stages could be impacted by ocean acidification, but we really still do not have a good understanding of how that will happen. It's likely not just to be ocean acidification that will have an impact. That, combined with a warming ocean, will potentially have an impact. We may even see changes in the overall productivity of our oceans as our climate warms and the oceans acidify. It's still very difficult for us to make really good predictions about that.
I'm a marine scientist in quite a broad sense, in that I work on fish populations. I'm also interested in the ecosystem effects of fishing, either directly through the capture of megafauna species, including some of the charismatic dolphins and sea lions and birds, and working out whether that's sustainable. And then also the ecosystem effects of extracting fish from the marine environment and knock-on effects on predators and prey.
Most bycatch dies as a consequence of being caught in a trawl net. In longline fisheries where they're caught on hooks, there's the mortality rate of bycatch is lower, and it tends to be a more selective method. It tends to catch the fish that people are after. But trawling, because by its very nature, it's a net that's dragged behind a boat. It catches pretty much everything in its path, unless it's small enough to pass through the mesh, or there's some mechanism to allow perhaps larger organisms like seals to pass through a special escape gap, because they can swim fast enough to get out.
We need to take a much more integrated and holistic approach to marine management, so that we're considering all the pressures that are occurring in the marine environment. So instead of sort of fishing over here and aquaculture there and a discharge there, taking a holistic approach with that. So looking at an ecosystem-based management approach. So that takes into account all the things that are happening, the values and the resource use we have as New Zealanders for that. It brings in Western science and Mataranga together as the knowledge base for that, looks at collaborative decision making.
Vision Mātauranga is a framework to kind of bring the Māori knowledge or Mātauranga into the science research field. It's about unleashing or realising the potential of that Māori knowledge that has. So we have research, we do research and science research, and if you have Mātauranga alongside that research, the outcomes are better. Mātauranga, you tend to have a holistic viewpoint on how something operates or something came about, or why it happens the way it happens. So the tension is, well, we just want to look at this side of thing, and the commercial side of aspect, but having the concept of kaitiakitanga, well, I have a responsibility, or there's a responsibility to look at everything that impacts on this one thing, and that's what the Mātauranga can bring.
Ecosystem-based management, from my perspective, is so important these days in order to bring all the different aspects into the model that we use in order to determine the health of a fish stock out there. And if you appreciate that we don't really know what's happening underwater. And now that ocean temperatures are changing, that whole complex is getting even more complicated. So as an industry, we take a very prudent approach, because in the end our livelihoods depend on that. We make investments of, say, somewhere between $20 and $80 million into a vessel, or $30 million into a factory, and you want to safeguard that investment by making sure that you've got ongoing supply of seafood. Whatever we take from the oceans, we should ideally measure, monitor, so that we know what our impact is, and go from there on in determining how we manage this resource. And I think there's still some way to go in this. Having said that, I also believe that more transparency is needed when it comes to the industry. Cameras on board fishing vessels is a big topic at the moment, and I feel that more insight needs to be provided in order for the public to gain the trust that the commercial industry out there is doing the right thing.
A lot of people have said to us that cameras on board are important because the data that they capture is really important. But the way that they have been set up is very much through a compliance lens. So we have a huge amount of data that's collected for compliance, but that data is actually much more valuable, first of all commercially, because you can work out what's in your net. So it's commercially useful, and of course it's also environmentally useful. So it's been captured under the umbrella of protecting the environment, but the motivation is very much for compliance. So if we can mine that data and actually use it to look at other species beyond the QMS species and really start to understand how the ecosystem's functioning, it would have way, way more value. And perhaps that would also let us move to a higher trust environment in which the fishermen are innocent until proven guilty, rather than the other way around, and they don't feel surveilled and they feel more trusted. Because I think most of the people that we talk to really do want to do the right thing. And the invasion of privacy and the lack of trust is not something that engenders the culture we need to move forward to our vision in 2040. You would hope that by 2040 the cameras would be in the net, looking at the fish, not on the deck looking at the fishermen. We've found lots of fishing companies, big and small, that are really focused on innovation. So there's a general acceptance that the trawling and dredging mechanisms of old do damage to the seafloor. I don't think anyone would dispute that. And there's been examples overseas where they've done really irreparable damage, and whole fisheries have crashed as a result. There's a real focus in some companies in New Zealand on harvesting the fish as carefully as possible. So if you're a small fishing company, that's quite easy to do. And there's a wonderful fishing company, Gravity Fishing, that is doing very bespoke harvesting and just literally catching to order down south. There's some small fisheries that are using innovative trawl gear with cages instead of nets, so that they improve the selectivity of the catch and reduce the bycatch. And there's some really big fishing companies that have teamed together. The best example is probably Sea Lord Moana and Sanford, who've clubbed together to implement Tiaki precision seafood harvesting, which was developed first of all at Plant and Food, and they've gone into partnership with MPI to roll it out on an industrial scale.
At Plant and Food Research, we work on a wide variety of questions that are relevant for fishing and fisheries. So we had the precision seafood harvesting program here at Plant and Food, which was like a multi-year long program that developed a new trawl gear technology to land fish alive.
We're a bunch of fish physiologists, so we're really interested in the whole animal and looking after the whole animal. And so all the research we've really done is about exactly that, whether it's looking at post-harvest concepts or harvesting concepts. We're looking at what does the fish need to be at its best. So back in the mid-2000s, my colleague Alistair Jarrett and I were working on post-harvest quality of hoki. So we're out on the fishing boats, similar to these things out here, and we were, and Alistair developed some cameras that went right down on the trawl. We were trying to understand where was the damage occurring on these trawled fish. And we managed to get some footage that showed us that at some times, and with some species in the net, they were actually swimming by themselves, looking after themselves, right down in the trawl of the net, so into the toe of the cod end. And so these animals were actually swimming and actually looking after themselves, whereas generally with deep water fish, when they're brought up, they're crushed back into the back toe of the cod end, and so that's how they're captured. The trawl is towed at a speed faster than the fish can swim, and they basically fall back. We were seeing fish that could actually swim down there. So it was from that video footage right down in the trawl that gave us that kind of aha moment of, you know, let's design a trawl system that can actually look after the fish during the trawl process. So in 2012, that's when the Precision Seafood Harvesting program started, and a real fundamental part of that technology is, again, understanding the animal and what the animal needs. We wanted to have a modular system that could be adapted and developed for different fisheries, different species, and with a view that we had escapement areas for fish. So if we caught undersized fish, our vision was to be able to encourage these animals to escape at depth. So where they were caught, have those animals escape at depth rather than bringing them up onto the deck. If, however, we did bring those fish back up onto the deck, especially in the inshore fishery, that they were in such a state that they were alive, that they were undamaged, that there was the potential then to put them back in the water to live for another day.
It's a very exciting time at the moment because so many technologies have advanced rapidly and they can now be started to be applied to the field of fisheries science. And one of these techniques is really genetics. Genetics can provide you insights into the species that you're fishing and gives you much better understanding of where they are found, how many there are, and where are the important stocks. It gives you an insight about the number of stocks. But you can also use more indirect genetic methods, and these are, for instance, called eDNA methods, so environmental DNA. So you can get an understanding about the whole ecosystem. For instance, you can take a water sample, you can extract DNA from that water sample, and you can get an understanding about the species that are also found to co-occur with the species you're fishing. You can also use eDNA from the soil, so you can go to the bottom of the seafloor, take a sample there, and you can extract DNA from that as well. So in a way, any environmental sample, you can use that, you can collect it, you can extract DNA, and you can get a much better understanding of a species. So because you understand much more about the whole ecosystem that you are, where you are fishing.
The fishing industry has a really big opportunity. Traditionally, they've been fishing for volume, so it's all been about volume. With New Zealand's reputation of being pure green around the world, and the fact that 80% of our fish are actually exported, we can actually shift from that volume to a value-based approach. So by doing that, I mean by precision sea harvesting, looking for the actual fish and precisely going for them, looking after the nurseries where the fish are breeding, looking after the whole ocean, the whole ecosystem to make sure it's as healthy as it can be. And by being renowned for that globally, the fishers can then charge a premium when they export. And so then the profit may remain the same or be even greater, but they are trading on value, not volume, which means for a healthy ecosystem for all, for the fishers, for the fish, and for our oceans.
Given the need for a more integrated and holistic approach to managing our fisheries, it is really encouraging that the government has appointed a new ministerial position, a Minister in Oceans and Fisheries Management. So yeah, that's really encouraging and a step in the right direction. So hopefully they can make some real action to reforming how we manage our oceans, not just our fisheries.
Mindful of the history of fisheries in New Zealand, the panel's tried to focus very much on the future, and we've picked a date of 2040 as a realistic time frame where, if all our recommendations are implemented, we would be catching fish in a more respectful way. So a bicultural approach and a high-tech vision where, for example, you could go out on a boat, have a look at your net with a camera that's on board and choose exactly the fish that you would like to harvest and let the others swim away.